Good afternoon, everybody. It's a huge pleasure to be back in Henley, where it's one of the nicest audiences that I've spoken to for many, many years, and it's good to see. I think there are quite a few familiar faces in the audience too. One day in December 1941, the brilliant young scientific intelligence officer, Dr. R.V. Jones, was poring over an aerial photograph newly taken by a Spitfire pilot leapfrogging at 0 feet above a Normandy cliff. The image showed a new type of radar called Würzburg, which the Germans were exploiting to make mayhem with British bombers. Jones's finger traced on the photo a defile leading up from the beach below the cliff. He said eagerly, "We could get in there." Here was the seed of what became, 2 months later, the most successful British Special Forces raid of the war. 120 men of the Royal Engineers and Parachute Regiment, led by Major John Frost, who later became a hero of the 1944 Brigade Arnhem, dropped into Normandy, overcame the German defenders, stripped the Würzburg, and escaped by landing craft across the Channel. In February 1942, a season of British defeats and indeed humiliations, Operation Biting exploited a leap of imagination, a heroic dose of courage, and a lot of luck to give Winston Churchill something that he then desperately needed, an authentic miniature triumph. After Dunkirk, most of the British Army was confined to its home islands, training for a resumption of the continental struggle, which did not take place until D-Day 4 years later. At all costs, however, and especially mindful of American public opinion, Churchill insisted that Britain's soldiers should not be seen to do nothing. He demanded raids on the continent by his new commandos and paratroops. As soon as he heard the proposal for Biting, he embraced it. Bruneval is a cliff-top hamlet 12 miles north of Le Havre. The German radar lay barely 90 miles across the Channel. When not much was happening anywhere else around Britain, Biting assumed an inflated significance. It was as if the floodlights of a great football stadium were turned upon a match played upon a mere fraction of its turf. Such glamorous figures as Combined Operations Chief Lord Louis Mountbatten and Airborne Forces General Frederick Browning competed for its laurels. The operation provided an early demonstration of the courage and enterprise of the fledgling French resistance. All my books tell people stories, but this one especially so. And this afternoon, I want to talk not only about the raid, but about the extraordinary array of personalities who directed and executed it. Responsibility for Biting fell to the Combined Operations Command, to which the Prime Minister had just appointed Mountbatten, destroyer leader and friend of Hollywood film stars. He possessed matinee idol looks and boasted cousinship with King George VI, together with charm, ambition, and some intelligence impaired by a childlike vanity. Born in 1900, he was the sort of professional hero whom the Prime Minister liked, advanced, and was not infrequently deceived by. Yet Churchill wasn't wrong. The glamour had a part to play in sustaining the spirit of the British people facing adversity. When Mountbatten was first offered the combined operations job, he resisted. He said he'd rather remain afloat after being sunk in the Mediterranean in the destroyer Kelly. Churchill responded furiously, "What can you hope to achieve except to be sunk in a bigger and more expensive ship? Here, I give you a chance to take a part in the higher leadership of the war." Mountbatten allowed himself to be persuaded. He would thereafter become one of the most famous British figures of the period. It remains disputed whether he was a substantial one. If he lacked depth of intellect, he compensated with enthusiasm. Bereft of any capacity for reflection, less still self-doubt, Mountbatten in his youth drove through the lower ranks of the Royal Navy like some advanced motor torpedo boat under uncertain control. Close friendship with the Prince of Wales, together with a 1922 marriage to Edwina Ashley, possessor of a vast fortune, earned suspicion and resentment from some comrades and superiors, as did his playboy lifestyle off duty. Yet he hauled himself up the Royal Navy through professional dedication. His courage was matched by a lust for recognition. He wrote in frustration when a young seaman fell overboard from HMS Warspite and drowned, while he himself was unluckily below. What an opportunity for anyone to earn an Albert Medal. Wish I'd been on deck. Mountbatten adored being married to riches and indulged himself in servants, cars, boats, homes. His London bedroom was remodeled to resemble a naval officer's cabin with a porthole which revealed a diorama of Malta's Grand Harbour displaying model ships that could signal to each other. When this atrocity was completed, he held a press viewing which confirmed his senior's view that Mountbatten was no gentleman, but instead a cad and bounder. Dickie's and Edwina's weekend guests at Broadlands, their Hampshire stately home, were issued each evening with a pro forma, which they were obliged to complete and return to the staff, saying what they wanted to do on the next day. A second docket invited them to bid for available cars, horses, boats, fishing. No extravagance was too vulgar, no presumption excessive that enabled Mountbatten to boost a polo team, win a race, secure a medal, or gain an appointment. Noel Card's 1941 feature film, In Which We Serve, made Mountbatten and Kelly famous, though lightly fictionalized. Noel adored Dickie, saying, "He's a pretty wonderful man, I think." Mountbatten never tired of screening the movie, hosting shows for his staff in combined operations and for the royal family. During both, he kept up a running commentary about the personal history on which the film was based. Yet his real record in command of Kelly was at best exceedingly unlucky. When he drove the ship gratuitously fast in heavy seas, she was struck by a wave which inflicted severe damage and almost caused her to founder. Repairs were scarcely completed before the destroyer hit a mine in the Tyne. After 11 weeks in dry dock, she emerged to be badly damaged in collision with another warship. In the Norwegian campaign, Kelly was torpedoed and almost sunk after rashly using her signal lamp at night in hostile waters. When Churchill, always Dickie's friend, sought the award to him of the DSO for getting the crippled ship home, the Navy would have none of it. His admiral wrote acidly, "Owing to a series of misfortunes, Kelly has only been to sea for 57 days during the war, and any other captain would have done the same." Mountbatten's sexuality was an object of speculation among his contemporaries and to posterity. His wife never provided him with the intimate companionship for which he yearned, although she acted out impeccably a public role as consort. He himself later said, "Edwina and I spent all our married lives getting into other people's beds." It was certainly true that Lady Mountbatten boasted a legion of lovers, but biographer Philip Ziegler comments of her husband, "Though he liked to imagine himself a sexual athlete, he seems to have had only slight enthusiasm for the sport. If asked to choose between seduction by the most desirable of houris and a conversation on service matters with a senior officer of influence, he would unhesitatingly have chosen the latter." There has been gossip that he was a closet gay, but ambition was surely too dominant a force for him to have risked a sexual scandal, which in those days must have been terminal. Mountbatten set about establishing combined operations as a film set on which not only would heroic deeds be enacted for the benefit of the British war effort, but these would also elevate the fame and fortune of himself, their executive producer. A cheeky staff officer composed a doggerel. Mountbatten was a likely lad, a nimble brain Mountbatten had, and this most amiable trait of each new plan which came his way, he'd always claim in accents pat, "Why, I myself invented that." Then, in December 1941, the Air Staff offered combined ops Reg Jones's proposal for an assault on Bruneval, the kidnapping of a Würzburg. As soon as Dickie heard of it, he loved it. He and his staff set about mobilizing ways and means. Operation Biting would need planes, ships, and a revolutionary force in warfare, paratroops. The chief of Britain's new airborne forces was another notable prima donna, General Frederick Browning, who became a second sponsor of the Bruneval raid. He was married to the novelist Daphne du Maurier, author of Rebecca. The outer Tommy, Browning's family nickname, lofty, assured, brave, masked one of the most complex and indeed troubled personalities ever to reach high command. Born in 1896, Browning's father was a wine merchant who occupied a large house behind Harrods in Knightsbridge. After Eton and Sandhurst, Tommy joined a Guards battalion in France in 1915. Only 2 months later, he was invalided home, diagnosed with nervous exhaustion. The cause appears to have been a condition known in the family as Tommy's tum. At irregular intervals, he was convulsed by agonizing stomach pains. These eventually receded, as they did in 1916. In September that year, Browning returned to France to find that only 6 of those with whom he'd served a year earlier were still in the line. At Passchendaele in 1917, Browning's battalion was committed to seize a German position, Gauche Wood. Casualties were devastating. He, still only a lieutenant, found himself sole unwounded survivor among 17 officers. He assumed command of the remains of 3 companies, repelled a German counterattack, and endured devastating shell fire before being relieved. Browning received a DSO, and for the rest of his career possessed a hero's reputation. Yet the emotional scars of Gauche Wood never healed. For the rest of Browning's life, he suffered what's now known as post-traumatic stress. Though always attractive to women, he seemed unable to form lasting relationships. The right girl eluded him. In 1931, he was a 34-year-old major when he first met the 24-year-old budding novelist du Maurier. She was instantly struck by Browning. He possessed both the physical attributes and apparently dominant personality which she demanded from a man. Though she'd already had several affairs, she struggled to define her own sexuality and, come to that, her rightful gender. Now, Browning seemed to meet all her requirements, and she made plain her eagerness to go to bed with him. This prompted a startling twist. Confronted by a beautiful and fascinating young woman, the major turned her down, to borrow P.G. Wodehouse's phrase, like a blanket. Affairs, Browning said, were sleazy. Nice girls didn't do it. Du Maurier's difficulty was that she'd always despised nice girls. During the weeks that followed, the besotted novelist sought in vain to persuade the grenadier of the joys of bohemian romance. He, however, is trying to teach me that those ways of living are messy and stupid and very, very young. It had to be marriage or nothing. It will take at least 5 brandy and sodas, sloe gin and a handkerchief of ethers to push me to the altar rail. Yet in the summer of 1932, the romantic novelist herself proposed to the Major and was accepted once he recovered from the shock of finding Daphne seizing the initiative. Friends who asked her father, Sir Gerald, the famous theatrical actor-manager, how he felt about the alliance, were told of his relief. "My dears, I'm delighted. I thought she'd have had a baby with a Cornish fisherman by now." Their subsequent marriage was notably complex, but intermittently happy, though she never reconciled herself to the army. She couldn't see the sense in military life, bugles and khaki and people yelling all the time and saluting. Emotional issues persisted. She wrote to her mother, "I feel I mustn't leave Tommy too much. He has these awful nervy fits of misery, all harking back to that beastly war. He clings to me just like a terrified little boy, so pathetic it wrings one's heart." She was struck by the contrast between Major Tommy in barracks, his tunic blazing with medals, barking out orders, and the sobbing, retarded adolescent who sought solace in the night. Daphne described Tommy's departures for duty as being like those of a miserable little boy being sent to boarding school. She scorned the duties of an army wife. The approach to war found her a stellar literary success, while her husband once again suffered attacks of Tommy's tum. The Brownings had been less than 10 years married when in the summer of 1941, Daphne began to conduct a flirtation which became an obsession with the owner of the mansion in which the Brownings were billeted, while she was penning another huge literary success, Frenchman's Creek. Even as Browning was selecting and supervising training of the paratroopers for the Bruneval raid, a domestic melodrama unfolded. Their landlord's wife discovered her husband in the arms of Daphne. Mrs. Browning and the children decamped to Cornwall, where her relationship with their former landlord continued. Posterity's image of the general is dominated by his role at Arnhem, the 1944 battlefield disaster for which he bore a heavy responsibility. But in 1941-42, he was perceived as a rising star. And today, Browning's key role in Operation Biting becomes far more interesting when it's understood that he was privately haunted by demons and a profoundly troubled relationship with his wife. Next up in the roll call of extraordinary biting personalities was the French Gaullist agent who delivered vital intelligence about the defenses of Bruneval while the paratroopers trained. Gilbert Renault was a pre-war loser, a 3-time bankrupt whose only success had been to win 5,000 francs in a national lottery. Yet in 1940, as the panzers approached his hometown in northern France, he made the decision to sail to England alone and offer his services to General de Gaulle, who then set up the standard of Free France, to return to France as a secret agent, a role for which he had no qualifications whatsoever. Yet de Gaulle, in his desperation and his own loneliness, accepted Renault's proposal, and he was duly sent back to France with more money in his wallet than he'd ever had in his life. And in the 18 months since, codenamed Rémy, he miraculously survived while creating networks of informants. Renault's family life was extraordinary even by the standards of the time and place. He installed his wife and 8 children in a hotel near Nantes. When he returned from one of many journeys across France, he was met by 3 of his offspring Catherine, Cécile, and Jean-Claude, who chorused, "We did as you asked us." What was that? To keep an eye on Maman, of course. True enough. Was she good? Very, said Cécile. Why very? She did not sleep with anybody, asserted this 6-year-old. A fellow wartime agent described resistance as a game, at the same time childish and mortally dangerous. Yet somehow Rémy survived. Some days his copious wireless messages to London contained valuable intelligence. More often they did not. But in the country of the blind, and information reaching Britain about France remained very scanty, the one-eyed man was king. In January 1942, Rémy was instructed to secure intelligence about Bruneval without himself risking visiting Normandy. He discussed London's signals with Roger Dumont, a former French Air Force pilot who was his expert on the Luftwaffe. Dumont said that he would make the trip to the radar station, and he then sought out a friend named Charles Chauveau, who owned a garage. And this calling entitled him to a German pass that permitted him to visit the Channel coastal region. The two men set forth on a wintry 120-mile journey through snowed-up France, itself a serious undertaking. The Gestapo was intensely active, already responsible for a grim roll call of executions of local patriots. Every traveller faced German checkpoints and patrols. Yet Dumont and Chauveau made it to Bruneval, having somehow coaxed their little Simca through miles of snowbound country lanes. They stopped at one of the hamlet's first habitations, a little hotel restaurant called the Beauminet. Chauveau said, I've known the owners for years. They're good people. They'll tell us what we need to know. Inside a quarter of an hour, Dumont was fully briefed with details of the Luftwaffe radar technicians, the German troops manning stock points. But with a courage bordering on recklessness, the spy then insisted that they must not return to Paris until he himself had viewed the beach defences. He and his companion walked boldly down the narrow track towards the German blockhouse at the foot of the cliff. A sentry appeared, whom Chauveau disarmed by addressing him in fluent German. We're only taking a stroll. I belong around here, but my friend is Parisian, and having got this far, he doesn't want to go home without having seen the sea. The German hesitated. Chauveau continued, we know we're lucky to have got this far. Anyway, I wouldn't dare go any further. They tell us there are mines. Ja, Minen. Would you maybe be so kind as to come on with us? Jawohl, said the good-natured, bored sentry, making the biggest mistake of his career as a guardian of Nazism. He became their guide through the last yards of this perilous odyssey, showing them the way through the war. He confided the vital information that there were, in reality, no mines. The two Frenchmen departed, and Chauveau drove Dumont uneventfully back to Paris, where he reported to Rémy. The network chief recognized at once that his agent had done a superb job. The signals Rémy dispatched to London represented a notable human success, a tiny operation blessed with almost incredible luck. Before the war, Rémy had seemed an absurd figure, a charlatan. Yet in France's supreme time of trial, there proved to be much about him that was fine and good, and it's unlikely that Operation Biting could have been brought to success without him. And so to those who were to do the business, the young soldiers committed to steal Hitler's radar, to form the point of the needle which Britain was to thrust into an exposed finger of Nazi-occupied Europe. The men of C Company, 2nd Parachute Battalion, commanded by 29-year-old John Frost, were overwhelmingly Scots. There were 3 Flemings, a Burns, a Finney, a Campbell, and a craw, together with many Macs. One platoon included a former commercial artist, Glasgow shipyard and factory workers, together with a furniture upholsterer. Many were smallish men, a legacy of the slums from which they came, but they were also iron hard. The oldest, 35-year-old Jerry Strachan of the Black Watch, was Company Sergeant Major. Strachan looked and was a tough proposition with his thrusting chin and steely grin. Men who slackened pace on their supremely arduous training marches grew accustomed to hearing his whiplash tones, demanding contemptuously, "Are ye tired, laddie?" Frost acknowledged that his Scots were a wild crew, but they were men who wanted to fight, and Britain then badly needed such eager warriors. The raiders also needed somebody with technical know-how to address the Bruneval radar set with a toolkit. Sergeant Charles Cox was serving at an RAF radar station on the Devon coast. In peacetime, this 28-year-old, charmingly cheeky little chappie had been a cinema projectionist in Wisbeach, Cambridgeshire. He was now bemused to be told to report to the Air Ministry. Next morning, 1st of February 1942, he found himself standing at attention before the RAF's Director of Radar. This officer said gravely, "You volunteered for a dangerous job." Cox hastened to correct this, saying that he never volunteered for anything. The Air Commodore said, "Well, now you're here, will you volunteer?" Cox responded, "Exactly what would I be letting myself in for, sir? I'm not at liberty to tell you, but I honestly think the job offers a reasonable chance of survival. It's of great importance to the Royal Air Force, and if you're half the chap I think you are, you'll jump at it." Cox volunteered. He completed the parachute course, finding it a thrill. A few days later, with wings sewn onto his tunic, he was dispatched to the paratroopers' operational base in Wiltshire. He received a civil welcome, though he struggled to understand C Company's jocks through their heavy accents. It was a curiosity of the British royal family's German connections that even as Lord Louis Mountbatten presided over biting, the Nazi trophy, which it was designed to seize, rested in the unworthy custody of one of his own cousins. 29-year-old Captain Prince Alexander Ferdinand von Preußen commanded the Luftwaffe Signals Company responsible for the Bruneval radar. The prince, like the Commodore Combined Operations, was a great-great-grandson of Queen Victoria. Moreover, his father was a friend of Hermann Goering. And this last relationship almost certainly explains why von Preußen was given a cushy billet in France rather than sent to the Russian front. He seemed to know little about radar, but a lot about partying. On the day of the raid, as it turned out, he told his staff that he was off to make a personal inspection and disappeared for the night to Paris. The British naval commander for biting was Admiral Sir William James, who presided from the great cabin of Nelson's Victory at Portsmouth. All the week scheduled for the operation in the light of moon and tides, the weather was too bad. The paras were repeatedly stood down. By the 27th of February 1942, it looked as if the whole thing would have to be scrubbed. But that morning, Commander Fred Cook, who led the landing craft flotilla, presented himself before the Admiral and pleaded for a 24-hour extension to allow his boats to sail that night. This Australian officer asserted confidently, "Biting can still be done." James's claim upon Fort Flame had been established not at sea, but instead back in 1885, when at the age of 4, he modelled for one of the most famous portraits ever painted by Sir John Everett Millais, who was his grandfather. James remained for the rest of his career in the Royal Navy indelibly associated with Pear's soap and known afloat and ashore as bubbles. Now a critical decision was thrust upon him. If Cook believed that his landing craft could get into the beach, weather conditions for the airborne assault appeared good enough to risk it. Yet Frost's men had become inured to anticlimax. They were amazed and euphoric when just after 3 p.m., Admiral James messaged tersely to all warships, Army and RAF units assigned to the Bruneval mission, "Carry out Operation Biting tonight." Mountbatten signalled, "To all hands, good luck, bite 'em hard." More than a few of the bomber crews who mustered at the airfield feared that they were flying the paratroopers to their deaths. Their commander, a celebrated RAF flying hero, Wing Commander Charles Pickard, said apologetically to Frost, "I feel like a bloody murderer." As each section marched out to their aircraft through the darkness, the company's piper played the marches of their regiments, Black Watch, Argyll's, Seaports. The skirl of the pipes evoked exultant cheers from the men who were in tearing spirits. They were setting forth to do or die for the first time and bursting with confidence. Afterwards, Frost looked back and marveled at their shared naivety. We knew so little. The Germans were to us a terrible people. Their armies knew no halting, and despite reverses in front of Moscow, they seemed formidable in the extreme. The drop, slightly mauled by anti-aircraft fire as the squadron approached, proved no more nor less chaotic than were most wartime airborne operations. 8 planes delivered their raiders exactly on target, while 4 landed 35 men up to 2 miles south of it. Yet though their absence weakened Frost's assault force, by extraordinary luck, all the vital players, especially the Major himself, together with Charlie Cox and his engineers, were poised to hit the radar station. They scrambled through the snow to assemble half a mile south of the radar site. By the time they approached the lonely chateau beside the Würzburg, they'd already been on the ground for an hour. It seemed a sort of miracle that silence still reigned when Frost blew his whistle to launch the attack. They killed 1 German in the house and 2 more beside the radar emplacement as they overran it in a storm of grenades and Sten gun fire. Frost's first impression on seeing the Würzburg in those days when radar dishes were novelties was that it resembled an old-fashioned gramophone loudspeaker. 4 German technicians fled into the darkness, but one was so panic-stricken that he plunged over the cliff edge, pursued by paratroopers. Peter Walker, their interpreter, who was really a German Jew named Nagel, joined a sergeant, peering down at the apparently paralyzed Luftwaffe man who was attempting the difficult feat of clinging to the cliff face while also keeping his hands up, a sight that caused the British to burst out laughing. Walker cajoled the man back up. They badly wanted an operator for R.V. Jones to interrogate. His first act, on literally collaring the prisoner, was to tear the Luftwaffe Eagle badge from his tunic. A bemused comrade asked, "Why have you done that?" This German in British uniform answered, "For my personal satisfaction." Meanwhile, Charlie Cox and the engineers set about stripping the radar cabinet. Even as they did so, obliged to use torches, defenders began firing wildly towards them. Though it didn't seem so at the time, Frost's 35 absentees gave important help to biting. Their dispersal confused the Germans, who felt obliged to dispatch soldiers in all directions, pursuing elusive paratroopers. C Company enjoyed a critical advantage in the early hours of the 28th of February 1942. Every man, even those who were lost, knew what he was in France to do. Enemy fire splattered among the paratroopers around the Würzburg, killing 1 unlucky Scot and holding the big radar dish. But Charlie Cox and the engineer party were able to keep working, wrenching whole sections of electronic parts from the set. And even as Frost, Cox, and the others struggled around the radar, the missing 35 paratroopers were struggling across country to join them. The most determined group was led by an eager young subaltern named Ewan Charteris, 20 years old, a former Wellington College prefect and games enthusiast, now auditioning to become a hero. He and his section exchanged fire with Germans who wounded one man. Then a bleakly comic incident interrupted their march. A strange voice began chattering to Charteris's rear man, who was electrified by his new acquaintance's choice of language. "My God, it's a bloody German!" exclaimed the astonished Scot. The bloody German, an equally bemused Private Adolf Schmitz, had lost his own platoon as it advanced uphill in search of the British and mistakenly added himself to Charteris's section. He now fired a single wild shot towards the paratroopers before taking to his heels. A sergeant loosed his Sten gun at Schmitz, who fell dead. Charteris and the others kept hastening north, obliged by their encounters with the defenders to adopt a circuitous route, which cost them extra time. It was now that fighting approached a crisis. As German shooting at the radar intensified, the engineers reported to Frost that they'd extracted most of the components. The major decided it was time to go. But as he and his men retreated westwards and began to descend the long slope towards the beach, German machine gun fire from the opposite face swept the hillside, badly wounding Sergeant Major Strachan. Frost ordered the engineer party to take cover with their electronic loot until the way was cleared. Most of the 35 missing paratroopers had been tasked to storm the beach approaches. The weak section that attempted to break through the wire entanglements and attack the German strong point had 2 men hit and then became pinned down for an hour, exchanging fire with the enemy. British post-mortems after fighting were self-congratulatory. All the reports agreed, however, that C Company claimed close to defeat, or rather to frustration of its escape in its protracted battle to break through to the beach. Frost was obliged to lead a brief counterattack back towards the radar site to push away Germans now crowding on his rear. He returned to the engineer party on the shoulder to find that the battle in the defile was still deadlocked. At that moment, a breathless Ewan Charteris arrived with just 3 companions. Charteris's role in the raid had been to storm the German beach strong point at the head of 20 men. Now he was told to mount his attack with whoever he could muster. The young man reached the bottom of the hill and surveyed the German position. He said afterwards, "I felt naked as a baby because I was only about 70 yards from the house, and for more than a month I'd been studying the best ways of attacking it. But when the moment came, reality seemed quite different. German guns appeared to command every approach." Charteris broke the deadlock by himself charging the beach house, throwing grenades and firing a Sten gun. And at that moment, some of his other lost paratroopers broke through German wire on the far side of the hill and ran down, led by a sergeant named Dave Grieve, shouting the Seaforth Highlanders' war cry to attack the Germans from the rear. Assorted British sections met at the house, having secured 2 prisoners, killed 2 more, one of whom fell to a bloodthirsty Glaswegian who used his commando dagger because he said he wanted to see if it worked. One bullet from Germans higher up the hill pierced the helmet of Corporal Vic Stewart, who fell crying, "I've had it." His neighbour, Rob Sterling, recoiled from the notion that the dead man's wallet, much thickened by pontoon winnings from half the company, should fall into German hands, and so he deftly retrieved them from his belt. At that moment, however, Stewart revived, realised that he'd only suffered a grazed scalp, and he demanded indignantly of Sterling, "Give us my bloody wallet back then." John Frost glissaded down the snowy hillside to find the situation transformed, mostly by Charteris. He himself wrote, "The object had been achieved. We'd given the enemy a good hammering. All we wanted now was the Navy. Yet the sea below sparkled, in Charteris's words, very, very empty. There was absolutely no sign of Commander Cook's landing craft. For C Company, it would be the bitterest pill of all if, having succeeded wonderfully, they were now obliged to surrender because they couldn't get home. The signallers carrying both wirelesses for contacting the Navy were still missing somewhere southward. Seaward torch flashes gained no response. The paratroopers and engineers clustered disconsolate on the shingle. On the cliff above, sporadic shooting persisted as the British rearguard held back the Germans with Bren guns. Thus, C Company was obliged to remain supine and very bitter for a further, apparently interminable half hour. It was past 2:30 when at last Cook's flotilla spotted blue torch flashes from the shore, and he gave the belated order to close the beach. 5 landing craft rushed in at 9 knots. Ashore, a signaller shouted that he was finally in radio contact. "Sir, the boats are coming in, the boats are here. God bless the bloody Navy, sir." The paratroopers, in their gratitude for deliverance, now forgave the agonizing delay. Of 6 stragglers still missing, one named Alan Scott met the saddest fate. Seeing the landing craft pulling away, the 24-year-old Londoner made a mad attempt to climb down the cliff and fell 200 feet to his death. His 5 comrades who missed evacuation became German prisoners and survived the war. The raiders' trip home in the flat-bottom landing craft became a nightmare of bedraggled seasickness. Cook later reported, "The wind freshened to force 5, which made the 80-mile passage very tedious and hazardous. But never better than 7 knots, they ploughed their course through the 28th of February, laden with more than 100 weary paratroopers and infantrymen, together with 3 very grumpy Germans." In Portsmouth Harbour, as the raiders clambered aboard their mothership, vessels around the anchorage broadcast "Rule Britannia," and crews cheered wildly. Drinks were pressed on cross men as they topped the gangway. A paratrooper said, "The German prisoners must have thought we were mad when they too had glasses of beer thrust into their hands." When John Frost finally reached his quarters in Wiltshire, he was about to sink into a welcoming bath when an officer hammered on his door and bellowed, "You have to get up to London right away because the Prime Minister wants you." 2 hours later, the exhausted Major entered the guarded and sandbagged entrance to the underground war rooms. He found Churchill surrounded by ministers and service brass, including Browning and Mountbatten, claiming proud parentage of success. Britain's leader was clad in a siren suit and puffing at the inevitable cigar. "Bravo, Frost, bravo," he said, "and now we must hear all about it." The Major stepped forward to tell his story. Mountbatten, however, was having none of that. He himself seized possession and addressed the group. Reg Jones was thrilled with the success of the mission which he'd inspired. The most important technological outcome of the Bruneval raid was it revealed to the RAF that a Freya-Würzburg radar combination could track and hunt only 1 aircraft at a time. Bomber Command responded by adopting streaming tactics, directing all aircraft of a night's attacking force through the narrowest possible corridor of sky in the shortest possible time to swamp the Germans' monitoring. And this secured an advantage in the electronic war that persisted for several months. Churchill's Chief of Staff wrote to the Cabinet Office, "The Prime Minister wishes Dr. Jones to be put forward for a high honour." He mentioned a companionship of the bath. Yet this failed to materialise, downgraded to a CBE, because the mean-spirited Chief of the Civil Service said Jones was too junior in the hierarchy to be allowed to become a CB. Among those who flew to Bruneval, Charles Pickard, who led the drop zone, got a DSO even though he himself had landed Charteris in the wrong place. The Navy's Commander Cook received a DSC despite his almost fatal delay in evacuating the raiders. The army was meaner, perhaps because Browning seems not to have cared for Frost. The Major and Charteris received more modest military crosses, while Cox got a military medal, but few other gongs were awarded to C Company. Nothing, however, could diminish the triumph of Biting. At a season of failures and defeats, the story made headlines across the country. Meanwhile, though Dickie Mountbatten gained laurels from Biting, across the Channel, his cousin, Prince von Preußen, who had been absent without leave when the British descended, got the sack. Bruneval offered Britain's novice paratroopers an outstanding opportunity to demonstrate the potency of surprise assaults from the sky. When the prospect facing Britain was still so grim, it was a great thing for the nation's war effort that such eager warriors as Johnny Frost and his men, together with Reg Jones, Colonel Ramey, Roger Dumont, Charles Cox, and the other remarkable personalities involved, could carry out a brilliant little coup which lifted the spirits of Churchill's people. Many of them perished later in the war, including Charles Pickard, Ewan Charteris, still only 21 when he died, Roger Dumont, the courageous French agent. Yet while it's often the case that heroic deeds gain no rewards to compensate for the sacrifices, this wasn't so with Operation Biting. The courage and imagination which it represented impressed Britain's enemies, as had few actions of Churchill's army since the onset of war. Bruneval became the first battle honour of the new parachute regiment, formally inaugurated in August 1942. It's a privilege in this 21st century to retell this stirring tale and to pay homage to the men who did it all. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. I'm delighted to try and answer some questions.
Lovely. Yeah, we've got some roaming right now.
But do shout like mad, because I'm unbelievably deaf.
We've got mics coming round.
Great.
Don't worry.
Right. I'm going to leave you all to find who you get to first.
Hello. Unlike Americans, the British forces often chose very prosaic names for their ops. Do you know why Biting was chosen?
Sorry, did I the last bit?
Do you know why the name Biting was chosen?
I'm terribly sorry. Can somebody repeat it for me?
Do you know why the name Biting was chosen?
Oh, no. All code names had absolutely nothing to do with the operations which they were destined. And Churchill gave an instruction that this should be so, but he also said they mustn't have completely ridiculous code names. When he saw that one operation, which a lot of people were going to risk their lives, was going to be code named Bunny Hug, he had this vetoed because he said what mother or wife how are they going to feel if they hear that their son or husband was killed on an operation called Bunny Hug. So all code names during the war were completely neutral.
Max, hi. I'm going to ask probably a pretty obvious question. I apologise for that. Why have very few of us heard of Operation Biting?
Why has nobody heard of it?
So few people.
I think it's a generational thing that as every generation learns these stories all over again, and everybody tends to run on railway lines. It's rather the same way. It sounds a rather stupid example, but when one goes to the great tourist sites in London, like Buckingham Palace and Westminster Abbey, you see zillions and zillions of people. But if you go to lots of the other parts of the country, we were in Gloucester Cathedral the other day, and one of the greatest cathedrals in Britain, was absolutely nobody else there. And so everybody tends to run on railway lines. So everyone goes on talking about D-Day and the Battle of Britain. But actually, an awful lot of other stuff did happen.
did the success of this operation and the amount of luck that went with it encourage the more disastrous raid, which also had Mountbatten involved, of the Dieppe landings?
You're absolutely right. The worst outcome of biting was it made Mountbatten wildly overconfident, and his staff and some of the others, that they felt that if the Germans were this sloppy, then one could pull any sort of stunt. And they never had another raid again. The Saint-Nazaire raid, which was successful in destroying the lock gates of Saint-Nazaire, but about half the people involved were killed or became prisoners. And then, of course, as you rightly say, Dieppe was a disaster. So I think the key thing, and John Frost said this in his memoirs, and I've heard many people say this since, you should always keep special forces small and special. And what was great about Bruneval was it was just a company strength raid. Well, they sent a whole division, about 7,000 men landed at Dieppe. And as soon as these things stop being special and become major operations, they tend to run into trouble. So, but you're absolutely right. Dieppe and co made them all terribly overconfident. And I've just actually been reading up for something else I've been researching about Mountbatten's behavior over Dieppe. One thing he was brilliant at was transferring blame to other people. And first of all, he went to great trouble after Dieppe to insist to the Prime Minister and everybody else that it wasn't his fault, he knew nothing about it, although he was head of combined operations. And he, even after the war, worked hard on Churchill's memoirs to insist that Churchill in his war memoirs changed his version of events. And actually where Mountbatten was successful was in convincing Churchill that since he, Churchill, had appointed Mountbatten against the wishes of the other chiefs of staff, if he, Mountbatten, was blacklisted or blackened for these failures, then Churchill, some of the unpleasantness was going to rub off on Churchill. So by and large, Churchill realized that he had not a lot to gain by allowing Mountbatten to be, but no, it was, the whole business of combined operations got completely out of hand. The best accounts in Evelyn Waugh wrote a paralyzingly funny account of combined operations. In one of his war books, he referred to one of the generals of combined operations who became known as brides in the bath because every operation he proposed, everybody got killed.
Could you please just give me or us a little bit of context with regards to combined operations and where it sat in the overall orbit of the machinery of the Second World War?
I think Churchill was absolutely right in 1940 when Britain had no real power to fight a big war on the continent, to set up the commandos and the parachute regiment and all the rest of it. It was what I call, it was part of what I've christened military theatre, that one had to give the British people and the Americans and later the Russians some sense that the war was still being usefully carried on other than simply by the bomber offensive against Germany. If the British had just sat there for 4 years between Dunkirk and D-Day doing nothing, well, never mind what the British people would have thought, that the rest of the world would have been appalled. And so Churchill's commitment to raids and to keeping some semblance of activity going, even if it wasn't very useful, was sort of part of his genius as a war leader. He realized the danger of everybody going to sleep again when the German invasion of Britain didn't happen and so on. I personally think the big mistake, by 1944, when D-Day was about to happen, I think all these special forces should have been wound up. And some of the excellent officers in parachute regiment and the commandos should have been distributed among regular infantry units and so on. And actually very interesting, a senior, very distinguished parachute officer wrote that in a very good book. He said he thought that all the absolutely first-class people in the parachute regiment by 1944 would have actually better served the British Army as part of regular line units than in airborne forces, because these huge airborne operations, as many of you would know, tended to go disastrously wrong. And in fact, I once took part in a night exercise airborne drop in Cyprus in 1963, peacetime, if you please. And it was such a shambles. 1,000 men were dropped with jeeps and heaven knows what. And we were all wearing Mae West because we were dropping close to the sea. We were told to switch on our red lights if we were injured in the drop. And by the time I landed, the place looked like Blackpool Illuminations. And I thought this is peacetime, and it's still.
Where did it sit within the hierarchy?
Sorry?
Sorry. Where did the combined ops operating model sit within the hierarchy, and how was it related to SOE? There must have been some.
SOE was another of actually SOE was far more useful use of resources, I think, than some of the other forces. But it's rather complicated. I'll draw you a map afterwards if you like. But Mountbatten, again, deeply against the wishes of the other chiefs of staff, Churchill insisted that he was appointed to the Chiefs of Staff Committee. So you had the Army Chief of Staff, Navy Chief of Staff, Air Force, and Churchill insisted that Mountbatten became the fourth Chief of Staff as Chief of Combined Operations. But in fact, the first Sea Lord nearly resigned over it. But at the front, we'll just wait for the microphone.
Didn't Professor Jones go on to advise Churchill on many other operations and still ended up without any distinguished reward for his services?
There's some truth in that. He was made a CB after the war, but Jones was one of those people who was absolutely wonderful, but he did have a terrific talent for quarrelling with everybody. And when Churchill returned as Prime Minister, in 1952, I always forget whether it was 51 or 52, he brought in R.V. Jones as his intelligence advisor, but this only lasted about 20 minutes because Jones quarreled with everybody in the Secret Service. Now, actually, I think part of the trouble that Jones not only thought he was much cleverer than most of the people in the professional civil service, he was, but that's always intolerable for these professionals. So. But he did get in these endless rows, and he ended up as a professor at Aberdeen University. And I think it was Margaret Thatcher who gave him a knighthood very belatedly, much, much later, which he richly deserved. And his book, if anybody hasn't read it, anybody who's interested in the Second World War, his book, his memoir, Secret War, is one of the absolute must-reads on the Second World War. I think we're about there, aren't we? Or I'm just looking at the clock, but we have time for one more question, if there is one more question. Who's got the microphone?
Hi. I don't think you're a fan of Mountbattens.
Sorry?
I don't think you're a fan of Mountbatten. Do you want to say some of the good things that you think he did throughout? To give us an example.
I think personally, in fact, I've written about Mountbatten in one or two of my books, and I've said that although I think he was a pretty disastrous Chief of Combined Operations, I'm one of the very few people who thinks that he handled the partition of India about as it was fairly disastrous, but I think he did it as well as anybody could. This is not a fashionable view. I'm almost alone in thinking that. But he was... The trouble is, I think Harold Macmillan wrote, and I've quoted this in Operation Biting, Harold Macmillan wrote about Mountbatten. He said he can never quite make up his mind whether he wants to be a royalty or a politician or an admiral. And this rather confuses people, and it ends up with nobody liking him. And I think there was a good deal of truth in that. I think that was Macmillan's view. Well, thank you all very much indeed for being such a nice audience. And